This is how to make the exterior patchwork pieces for the easy tote bag I shared yesterday. This is great for beginners because it uses a basic shape, half square triangle, but you get a lot of practice at making them and trimming them because we need 50 total, 25 for the front and 25 for the back. We are going to be using the 4 at a time method. So you will need 13 7 1/4 inch squares in both fabrics that make up the half square triangles. So mine were this black and white print and then some colors. So I have 13 of the black and white and 13 of the other prints, and they are 7.25 inches. What you're going to do is place one of the background prints and one of the prints right sides together, and you're going to pair them all up this way. I will just show one. Then you can pin them in place, and you're going to sew around all 4 edges, 1/4 inch from the edge. You don't need to leave anything open. Next, we're going to cut a diagonal line. I just use my rotary cutter and a ruler here and go corner to corner. And repeat this going in both directions, and you should end up with your 4 half square triangles. Then you can go ahead and repeat this with all of the other 12 pairs of the 2 fabrics until you have 52 total. We will only be using 50, so you will have 2 extra. Then go ahead and press your seams open. Then you need to trim these all down to 4.5 inches. To have all of your half square triangles pressed and trimmed, you're going to want to lay them out in a 5x5 grid layout. And I just did a random one here, and you're going to do this twice, once for the front and once for the back. Each should be 5x5 half square triangles. Then I go ahead and put together the rows first. I do this by placing pieces right sides together and then sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I just keep adding the pieces on till I have my 5 rows. Then I like to press the rows in alternating directions so that I can nest the seams, and then I put the rows together. Then you should end up with your 2 20.5 inch front panel pieces. And now you can go ahead and baste them to the batting with whatever method you prefer, whether that's pin or spray, and then quilt them however you want. And if you're interested in a little bit of quilt math, I used 4.5 inch half square triangles because you can count on those being 4 inches finished, as we are using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so we have to subtract a 1/4 inch from all of the sides, which is really like a 1/2 inch from both dimensions. I hope that makes sense and helps. Make sure to check out the other part on how to construct the bag. If you're looking for a beginner-friendly quilting or sewing project, here is an easy quilted tote bag. If you're not a beginner, this is also super easy to customize into any size you want. You can use a quilt block from your favorite quilt pattern. In this video, I'm just going to be going over the construction of the bag. If you want to know how I use the half square triangles for the design, let me know and I'll make a part 2. This bag is really simple, so we don't need a lot of materials. You will need some webbing, or you could make your own handles out of fabric. I'm using this cotton webbing. It is linked on my Amazon storefront. You will need 2 30-inch pieces of this. You could go a little shorter or a little longer depending on your personal preference. Then for the outside of the bag, you will need 2 20.5 inch squares of either fabric or 2 20.5 inch square quilt blocks, and then 2 pieces of batting that are the same size, and then you'll need 2 squares for the inside as well. I am using a canvas fabric here to make it more structured and durable on the inside. You could just use quilting cotton just like the outside if you want. These inside squares only need to be 20 inches each. First, take the outside fabric and the batting and quilt it as desired. Like I said, leave a comment if you want to know how I put these half square triangles together and quilted them. Once you have done that, you're going to want to trim these down to 20-inch squares each. I suggest 20.5 inch or larger to start with, just in case it shifts a little bit during the quilting process. Once you have the 2 exterior squares quilted and trimmed off, you're going to want to place them right sides together and line up all of the edges. Make sure that using directional fabric or a quilt block with a top and a bottom, that the tops of both tops are at the top, because we're going to sew this together how you want your bag to be. So the top of the bag, where it opens, will be at the top here. Once they are placed right sides together, you can go ahead and pin them in place, and then we are going to sew along the 2 sides and the bottom. You don't need to leave anything open except for the very top. And I am sewing these together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to box out the corners by marking a 2.5 inch squares on the bottom 2 corners where you had sewed the corners, so you will be cutting through your stitches. I like to mark it with a pen first and then use a scissors instead of a rotary cutter. Now to box out the corner, I go ahead and I take where we just cut out that square and I pull both sides on it so that the seams match up. So the bottom and the side seams should be matching, and then I like to clip mine in place. You can either open the seams or nest them and kind of pull at the sides of the bag a little bit to get this line nice and flat where we had cut open that square, and then pin it in place. And what we're going to do is sew along that line a 1/2 inch away from the edge. And this is what that should look like. I make sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of the stitches here. And you'll just want to repeat this with both of the corners. We are about done making the outside of the bag. Just turn it right side facing out and then set it aside. Now we're going to repeat the process with the 20-inch squares that we're using for the interior. If you're using like a printed fabric, make sure that it's facing right sides together and that the direction is in the right direction. And again, sew the two sides and the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and box out the corners just like we did with the outside pieces of the bag. You can leave the inside of the bag wrong side facing out, so you don't need to turn it yet. And what I like to do is sew the straps in place before I put all of the pieces together. So to attach the straps, I measured 4.5 inches in, and then I placed the middle of the strap right in the middle of the 4.5 inches. You could just do right at 4 inches or at 5 inches, whatever you prefer. Just make sure that they're all the same distance from the edge of the bag. And then I repeated this with the other side of the bag. This is the same strap. Again, I measured 4.5 inches from the edge and then put the middle of the strap in the middle of that 4.5 inches. I clipped these in place and then I just sewed them down 1/4 inch from the edge. You'll want to make sure that your strap is not twisted at all before sewing it on, and mine is, so I just flipped it over to fix that quick and then sewed it in place. You can repeat the same process with the other side of the bag with the other strap. Make sure you're not sewing through both sides of the bag when you put these on. Now it is time to put the entire bag together. So what we're going to do is actually place the exterior or the outside of the bag inside of the interior. The outside of the bag is right side facing outward, and the interior, the inside of the bag, is still with the wrong side facing out. So right sides of the exterior and interior should be facing each other. You'll want to go ahead and match up the side seams on both sides and then kind of clip or pin around all of the edges. I do like to open up the seams at this part when I'm clipping them together because you don't want it to be too bulky when you go to sew these together on your machine. Now I'm going to sew all the way around the edge, a 1/2 inch away from the edge, so 1/2 inch seam allowance, but I'm going to leave a gap for turning. About 3 to 5 inches should be okay. So here's that gap I left for turning. The rest of it is all sewed together. What I'm going to do is pull the outside of the bag outwards and just turn this right side out. At first it'll look like this, but then you'll want to put the inside of the bag, well, inside the bag. And then what we're going to do is top stitch around this entire edge on the top to make sure it's held down. I like to kind of play around with it, and then I actually pressed it with my iron, and right where you have that hole where you turned it, you're going to want to tuck those edges in about a 1/2 inch, and then I clip mine in place, and we're just going to top stitch around the entire edge to hold it all together. If your machine is having a hard time getting over those bulky edges, try slowing down or even turning the hand wheel on your machine to slowly get over that bulky part of the project. Let me know in the comments what you plan to use your tote bag for.